And I'm going to hand it over to Leon. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much for having us. So good morning, everyone. My name is Leon Smith, and I am the Executive Director at Citizens for Juvenile Justice. And I'm happy to be here this morning with my colleagues, Kate Lowenstein, who is our Multi-System Youth Project Director, and Ivana Boyd, who is our Community Engagement Coordinator. And we're really happy to talk to you about a subject that we not only talk a lot about at CFJJ, but there's a really core part of our advocacy, and that's trauma and the impact that it has on young people. So today we're going to be able to cover, trauma as it impacts young people in an educational context, and really the importance of all of us who are working with young people and advocating for young people, and really changing the narrative around youth behavior, particularly when these young people have been impacted by trauma. Then we're going to look at the specific trauma issues affecting young people in our child welfare system. These are young people who've come into a system based on allegations of abuse or neglect. So they're entering a system with trauma, but often find themselves re-traumatized by that very system on the way to worse outcomes. You were going to talk about those, but we're also going to give you advocacy tips in ways in which you can advocate to really disrupt the pipelines that these young people find themselves in. Really quickly, just to give you an overview of CFJJ, we've been around since 1994. We were founded as the only independent statewide nonprofit organization working exclusively to reform and reimagine the juvenile justice and other youth serving systems. And our mission is statewide systemic reform to achieve equitable youth justice. With that, Ivana, if you could pull up our presentation, we will jump right in and get started. So I'm going to get us started, really focusing on trauma education and the impact that it has on young people here in Massachusetts. And again, just really quickly, CFJJ, this is who we are, just so you have a little bit of background. And I really want to start, really what I believe is the foundation. It's really just, what are our definitions of trauma, and how does trauma, what does it look like as it manifests itself in a classroom? It's not enough for us to have this academic definition of trauma. We have to really tie that to youth behavior and how youth behavior manifests itself in school. So for starters, let's start with a definition of trauma: an event or situation that is extremely upsetting, psychologically overwhelming, and that exceeds an individual's ability to cope and produces distress. It's important to know that trauma isn't just that definition. Trauma can result from different sources. It can result from being directly harmed or indirectly from observing someone. So a young person who's been a victim of child abuse, for example, that is trauma. But a young person who's seen a parent involved in a domestic violence situation, that's also trauma. It can be single event, meaning a young person, for example, who's beaten up on the way home from school, or it can be chronic, as Kate will tell you about in our child welfare context, children who've endured ongoing abuse. Single incident trauma at times can result in a quicker recovery, as opposed to that happening as a result of repeated incidents, which is more difficult to recover from. And that's something really important to remember. It's not as simple as, oh, that happened a long time ago. Young people who've been victimized by repeated trauma is something that stays with them often through adolescence and into adulthood. And so it's important to make the distinction, because when you begin having conversations about trauma, sometimes people will minimize. There's a big difference between the stressors that every teenager, faces. They're worried about taking an exam, or they have disagreements with their siblings, their parents, their boyfriend, their girlfriend, or they're falling out with their friends, versus traumatic stressors, which are longer in duration, and they cause negative reactions that end up persisting. Normal adolescent stressors are really tied into that moment. You are stressed when you have that test coming up, as opposed to a traumatic stressor where something happens that impacts someone so much that it continues and persists in impacting the young person. And as CFJJ, as I mentioned, our mission, we look at all our issues through an equity lens. And it's important to know that trauma, the impact on different populations in our country, certain populations are impacted more by trauma. So as a whole, a significant percentage, just under half the children in the United States have at least one adverse childhood experience. But when we take that statistic and we branch out and we look by race, we can see that 61% of Black children, 51% of Hispanic children have experienced at least one adverse experience, compared to 40% for white children and 23% for Asian children. And you can see that, in New England as well, Black and brown children typically have more adverse childhood experiences, which contribute to trauma than white or Asian youth. And these biases, so we've established that, young people of color have more traumatic experiences. So what happens when those young people carrying the weight of those traumatic experiences come into a school building? Well, it ends up in racial and ethnic disparities in school discipline, who gets suspended, who gets expelled. What do we know from research about school discipline? It's not explained by differences in student behavior. We know that students of color are punished more severely for less serious or, typically subjective, infractions. Students of color tend to attend schools that rely more on harsh discipline than predominantly white schools. Sometimes in the same town, you'll have one school with a really low rate of discipline and one where the rate of discipline is sky high. And young people in those towns engage in similar behaviors, yet the student with a higher percentage of kids of color is the one that has the higher percentage of exclusions. And I wanted to highlight, a recent study that came out titled "School Deferred: When Bias Affects School Leaders." It's one of the recent studies that really drills home the impact of bias and how it plays out in school discipline, negatively impacting kids of color. So we have principals and assistant principals who participated in an experiment with hypothetical problems. The key point is that, so they were given hypothetical scenarios of a student who engaged in misbehavior. Sometimes it was a first offense and sometimes it was the second offense, but the names were randomized. So certain young people in the fact patterns had a name that sounded more, or was considered sounding more Black, and certain kids had names that sounded more white. And as we go to the next slide, you had the same behavior in these fact patterns. So one would say Hunter and one would say Darnell with the same factual situation. And Black students were more likely to be seen as troublemakers and were given more days of suspension, despite the fact that the scenarios talked about the same exact behavior. Even for a first offense, a kid who'd never been in trouble, Black students on average were rated 20% more severely than white students. And you can see how it continues. So we can see how it's not about, oh, well, these kids behave differently. You can have young people behaving as young people do, and it's the adults working in the school system who are treating them differently. And how does this manifest here in Massachusetts? In Massachusetts, we are highly rated for education, and at times we have an attitude of exceptionalism. Let's just call it what it is. But the reality is, the school to prison pipeline is a reality across the country, and it's very much alive here in Massachusetts. So you see that Black students are almost 3 times as likely, and Latinx students are 2 times as likely to be excluded than their white peers. Students with disabilities, these are your students who often are your most vulnerable students in your district, who need the most support, 2 times more likely to be excluded than their non-disabled peers. Now, we're going to talk much more about students with disabilities, further in the presentation. But the one I really want to drill in on, and that's, when we're talking about young people of color, young people who've experienced trauma and them receiving exclusion rather than support, it's not a high school thing. It's not a middle school thing. It starts from the youngest ages. Between pre-kindergarten and 3rd grade, we are talking 4, 5, 6, and 7-year-old babies. Black kids are 4.6, nearly 5 times more likely, and Latinx students are 3 times more likely to be excluded. When we talk about pipelines, it starts from the youngest age, and it is pervasive all the way through until these children cross the threshold into adulthood. And why does this matter? And I'm spending a few slides just going over the disparities, because when we talk about trauma and kids of color being more likely to have experienced it, so how does this exclusion end up affecting kids? Well, we know that kids who are suspended or expelled from school once are significantly more likely to be disciplined again and twice as likely to drop out of school. There is no such thing as just a suspension. Students who are arrested at school, because we see times that young people who exhibit trauma-impacted behaviors, instead of calling the school psychologist or the school social worker, they will call the school resource officer instead. And the school resource officer doesn't bring resources, they bring handcuffs and they arrest these kids. And that makes a kid 3 times more likely to drop out. And when kids drop out, they're 3.5 times as likely to be incarcerated during their lifetime. So let's really drill down, because again, we have this definition of trauma. We know that trauma has disproportionate effects, but what does it really look like in the classroom? What should we be thinking about when we know a young person's been impacted by trauma and issues come in school? The bottom line is that trauma creates obstacles to student learning. And as you see here, there's a list, and I'm going to go through each of these. These are different ways in which a young person's behaviors are symptomatic of trauma. These are factors that have a negative impact on the kid's educational success. But rather than identifying these behaviors through a trauma lens, which would provide more support, they end up being identified as problem behavior that leads to school discipline, exclusion, and even in some cases, school-based arrest. So the first one I want to talk about is trouble forming relationships with teachers or adults. So you have a kid, they don't get along with other students in class, they don't really get along with the teacher. It's easy to just label that kid as having a bad attitude. But in reality, young people who've been abused and neglected, they've been ignored and hurt by the adults in their life who they should have been able to depend on the most for love and support. Think about how that frames your perspective as a young person. A lot of these young people, they don't have a model in their lives of an adult actually recognizing their needs and giving them support. And they have little context of even how to approach someone and ask. These trust issues happen because when the people closest to you are abusive or neglectful to you, yes, you're going to have trust issues and you're going to be wary even of well-meaning and well-intended adults who come towards you. And so when you look at it through that framework, these are kids who need more outreach. They need more help. But what do? We discipline them and we withdraw even more support from them. So the kids who need it the most, we end up treating them in a way that exacerbates that trauma they've come into the door with. So poor self-regulation, when we talk about some of those, younger children who are being excluded up through children in high school, kids who have a difficult time really regulating their emotions. These are kids who are quick to be sent out of class. But again, let's reframe this through a trauma lens. Children impacted by trauma, they end up having a hard time managing those emotions. And it starts early, when babies and toddlers, so those of you who are parents in the room, children, learn to calm themselves by being calmed by adult nurture. A baby cries, a parent comforts them. But if a baby cries and no adult comes, that begins to start that pathway to that level of chronic dysregulation that you sometimes see in abused and neglected children. So again, the young person who gets really frustrated in class and they get really angry and they just have a hard time calming down. It's not a bad attitude, it is tied into trauma. That inability to refocus, the kid who gets mad in first period and then for the whole day, they just can't refocus. So even in some cases, these kids who are reliving trauma, they've had traumatic incidents happen the night before, a week before, at some point in their lives, these are kids, again, who need more support in navigating and redirecting and being refocused, not being further, put out of class and exacerbating the problem. Executive functioning, and again, this is one that we'll bring up again as well as we move forward. Chronic trauma impacts a young person's memory, the ability to pay attention, to plan. Think of in high school when you have multiple classes and multiple tests, and really just think through decisions. And I'll talk about this more later, but the symptoms of trauma can at times mirror that of ADHD and impact the young person's ability to follow the curriculum and perform. When it comes to homework, the kid who forgets their homework, who often gets labeled as a kid who just doesn't care. A lot of time that's not it. When you've been impacted by trauma and you have so many things swirling through your head, yes, there are times when you're going to be forgetful. It's also going to contribute to anxiety when you don't know what's happening next in your life. And, Kate will talk about this sometimes in a child welfare system that bounces kids around. You have that anxiety, you're gonna have a hard time focusing. And so just that ability of young people to really self-narrate, in our heads, we go to work and we kind of talk ourselves mentally through the things we have to accomplish during the day. There are kids who trauma brings so much chaos in their lives, they never gain that skill. And they often get labeled as kids who can't pay attention or kids who don't care, when in reality, they're just kids who are impacted by traumatic experiences. Now, hypervigilance is someone who spent years practicing as an attorney, not only in education cases, but in the juvenile justice system. The hypervigilant kid is the one who is most often pushed into that school to prison pipeline. That is the kid whose trauma is so significant, they exist in a state of fight or flight. This is the kid who can go from 0 to 100 with what seems like it's easy to look from the outside and say, well, what John did to Timmy didn't seem like much. I don't see why Timmy's reacting that way. But when you look at it again through a trauma lens, you can understand how when you're in that constant state of fight or flight, it doesn't take much to be triggered into that reaction. And as we talked about before, once a kid gets upset, it's really hard to bring them down. And then lastly, negative thinking. And this is something that those of you who work with young people think about. It's not all, it can easily come across as apathy and not caring, but put yourselves in the shoe of a child that from their youngest age has been made to think that everything that happens is their fault, which often happens with kids that are the victims of emotional abuse or of neglect. A kid who's constantly yelled at or screamed at is not going to raise their hand and participate in class because they've been beaten down to the point that they don't want to get it wrong because they're used to getting something wrong, leading to an extreme negative reaction. These are kids who, when they are met with exclusion rather than help, it's affirming. They've heard, in some cases, you have the kids who've been told even by people close to them, you're never going to amount to anything. So when they're then excluded or punished, in their head, it's just affirming those things that adults have already put into their head. So again, this is about peeling back the layers and taking a moment as adults and taking a deep breath and looking at that apathetic kid and thinking, okay, what has that kid been through to get to this point? And really just not just labeling our behavior, but looking at it through a trauma lens and really thinking this through. And so I want to talk a little bit, within the school context about young people who've been impacted by trauma. And it's not an overlap, but there's an intersection with special education. Students who have mental health issues or history with trauma, there are certain times where they may qualify for special education and related services. You have situations where, again, that abuse and neglect, some of the characteristics I talk about, it meets the threshold for an IEP in certain situations. Far too often, for 6 years, I represented young people on education matters who were incarcerated in the juvenile justice system. And when I looked at those educational records, time and time and time again, I saw kids who were branded as problems early, were suspended multiple times, year after year after year, and not once did anyone in those schools take a moment to say, you know what, maybe we should evaluate why this kid is struggling academically and struggling socially to see if something else is going on. They just got pushed along. So next slide. Oh, back one, yeah. So when you think about some of the symptoms of trauma, there are 13 different disability categories that a young person can qualify for special education. Often we think of young people who are learning disabled, young people speech impaired, who are blind, who are deaf, but there's a category called emotional disturbance or emotional dysregulation, depending on how the regs are written, federal or in a particular state. It doesn't require a specific mental health diagnosis, but it applies to students who exhibit any of these 5 bulleted behaviors for a long time to a marked degree, and the key here, has an adverse effect on their educational performance. So if you look at those bullets, I'll just go quickly to the next slide to show how this really comes together. So when you have a young person, think about those trauma impacted behaviors that I went over earlier. So that inability to learn, not explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, meaning the kid has the academic aptitude, but they're scattered and they're not. It's executive functioning. That's a symptom, inability to learn, not explain, executive function, symptom of trauma. Inability to build or maintain interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers. The criteria for emotional disturbance eligibility ties into trouble forming relationships, a symptom of trauma. Inappropriate behavior or feelings under normal circumstances. That is the criteria that ties into poor self-regulation and hypervigilance, symptoms of trauma, and in general or pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression that ties into negative thinking, which with young people impacted by trauma, we see at times manifest with levels of depression, which impact their education. So again, when we begin to look at these behaviors with the trauma lens, you can see how they match certain criteria that could be a pathway to a young people getting additional support. And then another, of the 13 categories that I'll quickly go over is other health impairment. So due to a chronic or acute problems, including attention deficit disorder or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, when it adversely affects a child's educational performance. ADHD, and again, not every young person with ADHD, but in some cases, ADHD has such a significant impact on a young person that it impacts their ability to access the curriculum. That is another pathway into a young person receiving an IEP and specialized instruction and related services. The area where you have to be careful here, as I said earlier, trauma often mirrors the symptoms of ADHD. So this is why when a young person has that poor self-regulation, even when you have the younger children and they're very hyperactive, they're getting into trouble for not obeying the rules of the classroom, it's really important to evaluate. Let's determine, is it trauma? Is it ADHD? You don't want to get into a situation where you're medicating kids who don't need it. Maybe the solution is counseling, but you can't just look at the behavior and make a knee jerk and start disciplining and making judgments. It's important to evaluate and then really go through the evaluation and determine the best way to approach those particular behaviors. And so just really quickly, if you have a young person who has been impacted by trauma, and there's, I would say exceeding one whole school year's worth of significant problems with school exclusion or significant academic underperformance or academic failure. Again, don't allow yourselves to be told that a student has to be failing to be a subject to this conversation. If a student has the ability to get A's and they're getting C minuses, that is still a student underperforming based upon these behaviors. And again, ensure that student behavior is viewed through a trauma-informed lens. If you have knowledge of the young person's history and the family history, don't let folks label kids. Say, well, let's take a moment to understand in light of what this kid has been through, reframe. Always shift the focus away. When students have issues in school, it's always about, what's the punishment? What's the response? Shift that. Well, how are we going to help this kid? We have resources here. How are we going to help this kid? And with a young person, center the young person. Ask, what happened? Are you okay? Why are you upset? So much of the reaction, our reactions are, what's wrong with you? But for some of these kids get to high school and no one ever takes the time to ask, why are you upset? It's a simple thing, but it means something to a young person. And so just a couple of other tips. If you're working with a young person, there hasn't been a big significant incident like a fight or something like that, but the young person, they're beginning, maybe some in-school suspensions or maybe being sent to the principal's office before something significant happens. If you're working with a kid who has an IEP, and despite that IEP, they're starting to get in trouble, push for a functional behavioral assessment. That compels a school to collect data on a student's behavior and what works for a student to redirect them and what doesn't work, and actually develop a behavior intervention plan, which becomes a part of the IEP, and it follows a kid and it lets teachers know when this student is feeling this way, this is how you should deal with them. This is not how you should deal with them. Think of a student who's autistic. Think of a student who's been impacted by trauma. How you approach that kid is so important. And going through a FUBA and a BIP is able to make sure there's a document and a guide point that can follow that kid on those areas. For students who are impacted by trauma, who doesn't have an IEP, that's when it's say, okay, you know what? You've suspended this kid multiple times. There's something more going on here. The student's grades aren't well. We need to have an evaluation. And that's not the same as saying, oh, let's put. No, when you take the time to have an evaluation, maybe it results in special education, or maybe it just results in additional insight into what a kid is going. That evaluation is so important. Now, if a significant incident occurs, so a kid, gets into a fight, a kid flips over a desk and damages something, it's important to have, a game plan. So the first thing we have to do is determine if there's a change in placement. So anytime a student with an IEP is moved to another educational setting, either inside or outside the school, in-school suspension, out-school suspension, and that removal is for 10 consecutive days, or if there's a series of shorter, the 3-day and the 4-day and the 5-day suspension that amounts to more than 10 days in a school year. Anytime any of these things happen, go to the school and say, we need to have a manifestation determination. When it comes to kids impacted by trauma who have IEPs, this is one of the most important advocacy points. So next slide. Oh, yeah, here we go. So what is the manifestation determination? Again, it's really important. And then here we have, the criteria. It's a special IEP meeting that has to occur within 10 days of the change in placement, meaning that kid is removed from a regular classroom to another classroom, for example, in-school suspension or out of school. And the meeting really determines whether the conduct the kid has been disciplined for is a result or the manifestation of the student's disability, or as a result of a failure of the district to implement the IEP. So yes, the student acted out and the school wants to react, but that is an opportunity to have a meeting to say, you know what, this kid had behavior intervention plan. Did all the school staff involved follow the behavior intervention plan before reacting this way? Or is this behavior out of a student's disability? So again, we showed those criteria for emotional dysregulation or emotional disturbance. If a kid has an IEP for one of those behaviors, and the behavior is clearly out of that behavior, you have the place to say, no, it's a manifestation of that kid's disability, and we don't punish kids for behavior arising out of their disability. And so if the behavior is found to be a manifestation of disability, that kid has to go back to their previous educational placement. Now, there are certain exceptions. When there's weapons, drugs, serious bodily injury, they can move that kid into an alternative setting for up to 45 days. In my experience, during those 45 days, that's an opportunity to compel the district to make a referral at times to get an out-of-district placement or just a better placement for the young person, because that's the opportunity to say, you know what, you have used the resources you have, you're not meeting this kid's need, and that's why this kid's in this position. This 45 days can be a transition point. Let's find this kid, let's help this kid get into a better placement for them. And again, the district still had that obligation, to educate the child. The last point's the key one is if they say, well, we just don't think it's a manifestation of disability when you believe you've made the case that it is, that's not the end of it. You can file a due process complaint that effectively acts as an appeal of that meeting to the Bureau of Special Education Appeals. So it's important to equip particularly parents with that, because there'll be a case where it's a clear manifestation of disability. School will push back and disagree. But if a parent has that foresight, or if there's an attorney involved and says, well, we'll just have to settle this at the Bureau of Special Education, while that pins, you'll see things start to shift in that meeting. So I put this slide in just as a reminder, when it comes to young have disabilities but haven't been identified, yes, as advocates and people who care about children, we should always raise these issues with schools. However, IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, places an affirmative obligation on school districts to identify, locate, and evaluate any children that are in need of special education. So as advocates, we should always pursue it, but always remember to hold schools accountable. They should have protocols in place that when students are not doing well academically or are engaging in behaviors that are impacting, they should be proactively going and saying, maybe we should evaluate. And if they're not, they are out of compliance with 300-111 of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. So again, another piece for your advocacy toolkit to push back on school districts who are quick to discipline but slow to evaluate. And then the last piece is that process of getting a young person evaluated. It's called a referral. It only requires there to be a suspicion of a disability. You do not, and I put this here for misinformation that is out there, but you don't have to walk in with something from a doctor saying this kid has ADHD, this kid has post-traumatic stress disorder. No, it only of a disability. And so again, it should be in writing, but again, just some information on the referral process. So really quickly, I'm gonna go through, it's hard to talk about trauma in young people and not talk about bullying. We know, again, the severe impact that bullying has on young people, including being a contributor to truancy, as some develop a fear of going to school. And we know that frequent bullying, it creates trauma that follows young people into adulthood, where they're at greater risk of suffering depression, other mental health problems, including schizophrenia. And it's important to note, so much of our juvenile justice system lens is on boys. Bullying actually has a harsher impact on our girls. Just again, something that's important to look out when we're looking at trauma. And so really quickly, this is the Massachusetts bullying statute, which is a reminder that it applies to behavior that happens both on and off school grounds. And just as a tip, when kids are experiencing safety concerns in the community that lead to a young person not feeling safe to come to school, or it leads to truancy or dropping grades, or just trauma impacted behavior, it's important to approach the school and say, 71 section 370, what are you doing about it? It's not just file a CRA and send the kid to the system to fix it. School district, you have obligations. And so again, really quickly, when a kid who has an IEP is bullied, the district has an affirmative obligation to convene an IEP team meeting and determine whether, as a result of the effects of the bullying, a student's needs have changed in such a way that the IEP is no longer designed to provide a meaningful benefit. So anytime a student who has an IEP has suffered trauma as a result of bullying, it's an opportunity to revisit the IEP and see if there are additional services needed for the student. And again, really quickly, this is just a quick list of options that, again, this is in the law. When a kid is bullied, schools have an obligation to do something, and hone in on that first one. Schools are supposed to be using strategies for providing counseling or referral to services, both for the perpetrators and the victims of bullying those students. So it's not just a matter of, okay, the kid who's the bully today, who was bullied before, and just punishing and pushing kids out of school. It's within the law to look for alternatives and try to counsel students through that behavior. And so now I will shift from the school context, and some of the trauma conversation we've already had has really laid a foundation for Kate, who's going to come in and really talk about our trauma to prison pipeline as it relates to young people who are in our child welfare system.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and take it from here and really pick up to take this into how trauma leads to the prison process. So here we go. So the work I do with CFJJ was also to look at the feeder systems so we could understand a bit better who the kids were in our juvenile justice system. And as Leon mentioned, what we saw from the data and the research was that the majority of the youth committed to the Department of Youth Services to juvenile justice system had spent time in our child welfare system. So we want to talk about that because, again, all these behaviors that lead to arrest. So it's important to start with the framework that foster care alumni experience post-traumatic stress at a higher rate than our Iraq War veterans or our Vietnam War veterans. This is incredibly important information. Again, also understanding that PTSD is a very limited way to sort of frame trauma in young people. And I saw that someone had a question about complex PTSD in the chat. And so I actually dropped a slide in so we could go over that. So this is going to address that. So complex developmental trauma, they sort of overlap, but it involves a chronic or repeated early onset exposure. And the critical piece is the caregiver instability, and that the trauma is coming at the hands of caregiver or someone who's in charge of the emotional development of the child. And developmental trauma also is happening while the child's brain is developing, critically important for how a child the brain develops and how they modulate their behavior. So it's different from PTSD and ACE scores. Many of you may already know this, but it is so important to understanding the kids that we are talking about. So this goes to what Leon was speaking to in terms of self-regulation, hypervigilance, but really important, this piece about a survey showing that child welfare, 70% of youth in child welfare met the criteria for complex trauma, and 2/3 of youth involved in our juvenile justice system. And again, speaking to, touching on what Leon said about many assume that, trauma or developmental trauma that happens to very young children doesn't impact their later behavior, and which is exactly opposite the true. It's exactly what comes up at different stages of development. The trauma comes out as the child develops. So foster youth, separation from family, the reasons for the separation, these all lead to multiple exposures to trauma. Compared with children not placed in foster care, children placed in foster care are more likely to have fair, poor health, 2 times as likely to have learning disabilities, 5 times as likely to have anxiety. And we can really think about how anxiety shows up and how it's misinterpreted or interpreted differently in terms of children at different ages, but particularly in terms of race and ethnicity. So here we're going to get to really the heart of the Citizens for Juvenile Justice, our concern about what happens in school, but also children who are involved in our child welfare system, their trauma, and what that means in terms of juvenile justice system involvement. So what we saw was that, again, that over 70% of our youth in DYS, so there's the detention population, but those in terms of committed youth had been involved with DCF in their life. So they were very young when they were first involved with DCF. They first came into contact at that 0 to 3 age group. And of course, it should not be surprising that boys and youth of color were overrepresented in the dual status population. The reason I say it should not be surprising is that anyone in the field at this point should really understand the impact of systemic racism on the lives of all of our children, particularly our most vulnerable children. So this is incredibly important because we're going to get to the question of what are the drivers that we could find through the data of children from our foster care, our child welfare system into our juvenile justice system. So this issue of multiple placements, right? So our federal government considers anything over 2 placements is considered a high rate of placement instability. And we're going to get into how Massachusetts fits in the country because it's very important for you all. We know that your interest stems from your work with children, and so many people understand the children in front of them, or even the particular setting that they're in. And we just really want you all to understand the larger context of Massachusetts, and even the larger context of Massachusetts within the rest of the country, how we compare. So children who are moving from placement to placement, this is very highly correlated with the worst outcomes for children. If you can imagine, it's pretty simple to imagine how harmful it is for a child to be in many different placements over their lives, despite the fact that adults themselves personally feel like the placement is safe and stabilizing. That is not how children's brains comprehend stability. But when you're talking about 6 to 10, 11 to 20, 30 to 40 placements, we can all agree that at some point, some adult in that child's life should have said, this is too much. We have to stop and figure out what is happening. So this goes to, I think, very important for you all to understand what are the very high correlations between child welfare involvement, which we can understand is very correlated with the trauma of that involvement, right? So there's the being removed, there's whatever happened in the home, there's the actual removal itself, and the attachment disruption that happens when a child is removed. So things that we think about are, we have spoken about a bit more about this in terms of family separation at the border. Well, family separation for children is still highly impactful on a child's brain. right? And then this issue of placement instability, moving around from home to home or placement to placement once they're pulled in. These very vulnerable ages of 12 to 15, many of you who are in school settings know how vulnerable that age of 12 is, that 6th grade year. These are incredibly transitional periods in a child's development and in their experiences throughout their experience at that time, but particularly in school, middle school. More episodes in foster care. So we're being returned home and then being removed again. And this issue of congregate care, which we will touch on strongly in a little bit, but the underlying and overarching issue of poverty threads throughout all of this, as does systemic racism. So the many current trends in Massachusetts child welfare are correlated with the factors for the worst outcomes. And I think this next part is going to be surprising to many of you, but it's so critically important. So we had an extreme increase in children removed from their homes starting in 2012 to 2016. We're watching carefully what happens during the pandemic, but we overstretched our systems to the maximum capacity. We don't have enough foster homes. We don't have enough mental health counselors for children, as many of you already know. We had an even more of an increase in 2016. We believe that the Trump administration, and along with what's called foster care panic, led to this happens in states when a child dies, either if they weren't removed or if they were removed and died in foster care. There's something called a foster care panic, and children are removed from their homes. I made this map in order so we could really understand how the impact on certain counties, all the counties were impacted, but the extreme impact on the resources in counties. So if you can see, Franklin County has a very low population rate. The removal rate went up to 90, it increased by 90%. There was a 56% increase statewide. But a county like that, where they just do not have the resources to support the children and families and the trauma that they've experienced, we thought it was really important for our decision makers to understand these issues. The removal, so the increase went up between 2015 and 2018, but Latinx youth accounted for 82% of that increase. This is incredibly important. This is why CFJJ looks deeply into data, because it's not just enough to understand pure numbers. We have to understand who and where. The increase, so as you can see, it went down for everyone, but mostly for white youth. That decreased the most, but Hispanic Latinx youth continued to go up. Again, we have to understand as a society what is happening. There's been some speculation. It was not, we looked deeply into whether this was an opiate crisis issue, as it was, we know, starting in 2012, or whether this has had more to do with the Trump administration family separation policies, which were also led to ICE raids in Massachusetts. So Massachusetts ranks 50th in outcomes of youth in state DCF custody. This comes as a surprise to most people, given Massachusetts' reputation as a very progressive state, but it's incredibly important for you all who are working in this state to understand the children among you and how we are faring in terms of how we're doing with our foster youth. So we have the highest rate of reported abuse and neglect, 48th for safe permanent homes, 50th in placement stability, 47th in homes for older youth. We have a very high rate of youth aging out of foster care without a permanent home. Also important for you all to understand how stark the race and ethnic disparities are in Massachusetts, right? So we have the worst inequality between white and Latino residents of any state in terms of income, housing, poverty, unemployment, incarceration, and educational attainment. Highest disparity of imprisonment of Latinos in the country. Highest disparities of juvenile arrest or Black youth at a rate almost 3 times higher than white youth. And in terms of juveniles, the highest disparities for probation, detention, and commitment are for Latinx youth. We really wanted you to understand who the youth are. And so if you look at this, you can see the population. The blue is the population of our under 18 youth statewide. And then you can see the flip in terms of who is removed from their homes. Now, hopefully this is not news to you, that abuse and neglect happen equally across all race and ethnicities. But the racism of the systemic racism of our systems, including child welfare, which from its inception was steeped in a white middle class view of how children should be raised, and also an extremely anti-poverty view of what accounts for neglect and abuse. We really come to these disparities in our state. And I also really want to highlight, I know someone else had a question about Indigenous youth, and I'm going to get to that. But it's really important for people to also remember to think about multiracial youth. They often get lost. These are children of color, and Massachusetts has populations, several different populations that don't identify as Black or don't want to be identified as Black or white or Latinx due to their heritage. And it's so important for us to honor and respect that. So the disparities start from the beginning, and we really wanted everyone to understand the 51A reports, right? So the children statewide, and then who gets filed on, again, understanding that abuse and neglect happen equally across all races, and really important for everyone to understand as we come out of this COVID epidemic, who is going to be reported on and filed on. The 51As come from school, again, moving into some of this school-based issues that we've been talking about. So there was a lot of concern during COVID-19 when kids weren't under school. There was a little bit of this sort of dog whistle, conversation about, oh, we're not getting enough reporting. Yes, there was an incredible amount of stress on families. There was incredible high rates of sickness and death and extreme stress. But it's also important for people to understand that 51As filed in school have the highest rates of being screened out. So we know that there needs to be more training in terms of school personnel about what is important to file, when it's important to file, and what the repercussions of that filing are. Furthermore, really important for people to know that about 86, almost 87% of the maltreatment in Massachusetts are for neglect, right? So we really have to understand that we're talking about neglect, whereas some of the high profile stories are zeroing in on physical. People think it's a physical abuse, but we need to understand what neglect means, right? And how often neglect is conflated with poverty, and how do we start to pull those two? Neglect is a very serious thing that no one is saying that it's not, but we really need to understand what is our state, what is our system response to the issues that are brought up in neglect. The most dangerous place for a child to try to grow up in America is at the intersection of race and poverty, right? We really wanted to put that out there strongly when it comes, again, to these intersectional issues of poverty, race, and then this concept of what is neglect and the separation of children from families. So children of color are overrepresented in the removals for neglect, as you can see. Also important to know that 51As are viewed by many as the stop and frisk of Black and brown mothers. This is a way that our system reports on and surveils Black and brown mother parenting and puts it through the lens of what is considered, again, something that needs the Department of Children and Family versus what is considered in need of support for that family or that mother. Children in out-of-home placement, again, who ends up being removed, right? So the 51A is the reporting, and then who ends up being removed. African-American and Black youth are almost 2.5 times the rate of removal compared to white. Latinx youth, again, over 2.5 times the rate compared to white. 71% of Black youth in Massachusetts will be subjected to a DCF investigation before they turn 18. That should stop everyone in their tracks. When we're talking about the stop and frisk of Black mothers, this is what we're talking about. Hispanic and Latinx and Native American youth in Massachusetts have nearly 2 times greater risk than the national median of being the subject of a DCF investigation and out-of-home placement. Again, we're talking about invisible to most people, extreme race and ethnic disparities in Massachusetts in terms of who becomes a subject of an investigation and who is deemed should be removed from their family. 13% of Native American youth in Massachusetts will be separated from their families before age 18. That's the highest risk of home removal for any racial or ethnic group. Really important, and I'm going to move through this, but LGBTQ youth are at extremely high risk in Massachusetts child welfare system and have been calling out for help for many years. CFJJ has formed with our allies at GLAD a statewide LGBTQ youth in foster care or involved with DCF alliance. Anyone who's interested in this issue, please reach out to us because the harm is extreme. We're talking about kids who may have been rejected by their home of birth and then are put into a foster care system that does not have LGBTQ affirming homes. They can be put in foster homes that are homophobic or transphobic. We're really pushing for more data for DCF to collect data across and make sure that it's intersectional, because you can't collect the identity, understand the identity of one part of a youth without understanding their entire identity as well. And too often we just say this many LGBTQ youth, and over here is their race and ethnic identity. Schools really need to step up on this and understand the extreme bullying that LGBTQ youth face. And I highly recommend people go to the LGBTQ Youth Commission and look at their most recent report on DCF involved LGBTQ youth. This I'm finishing up, and I'm really trying to again give you all the visual because we thought it was important for you to understand the age groups. So you can see 6 to 11 and 12 to 17. That's where most of our foster youth are in schools. They're in our schools, and have experienced trauma, and they desperately need support and our help in terms of understanding how their trauma manifests, in terms of and also the way that we punish and discipline behavior related to trauma. They've also, in Massachusetts, our children are staying longer and longer in foster care. Foster care is supposed to be a short-term solution to an immediate issue of stabilizing or supporting the family or finding kin to place family with and keep them there. They should not be staying in foster care for these very long periods of time. 4+ years in foster care is a failure of the system. As you can see where the children are also, Worcester has our highest number of children in foster care. This is also important to understand the school systems as well as the impact of on the resources of a county. The biggest areas we know that we can address placement instability and length of time in placement, as I just said, every time a child is moved, they become more shut down. Their trauma has increased and become more complex. It becomes more difficult. They fall behind in school. It becomes more difficult to find mental health services for them and for them to be able to create secure attachments. I'm going to finish up by showing you what we know about how our foster youth are doing in school. And because we have the data, and as do our systems, our school system, our Department of Education, our Department of Children and Families know how badly behind our foster youth are doing, how over-disciplined they are. But this issue of the lack of access to developmentally and culturally reflective and affirming mental health services, not to mention trauma-informed services, is at a crisis level in Massachusetts and has been long before COVID hit. Number one, we need to place children immediately with kin in terms of when you're asking about what can we do better, right? It lowers placement instability, much better long-term outcomes. A problem in Massachusetts as across the country, but Massachusetts has a problem where over-policed community of color are disproportionately ruled out as kin placement. This has to be corrected. It used to be able to be waived if a Corey check reflects something that has nothing to do with harm or danger to children, we could waive that. And then Massachusetts pulled back on that, and now we're keeping children away from very supportive and family homes due to over policing. this Leon touched on, Leon spoke in depth about how schools treat behaviors. So I'm going to move quickly through this because you all know this part. You should know that 75% of youth, when they enter care, change schools. Placement disruption, it equals a school disruption, right? So they're 2 times as likely to be absent, 2 times as likely to be suspended, 2 times as likely to drop out, 3 times as likely to be expelled. And youth in out-of-home care, you lose approximately 3 to 6 months of academic progress. If you think about what that does mentally to a child, right? When you lose 3 to 6 months of progress and then you get held back, the likelihood of you staying in school becomes less and less each time that happens. 75% of children in foster care are behind at least 1 grade level. So finishing up, this is how students in mass foster care do. 47% are chronically absent. These are the children that are in foster care, right? So these are the ones that the state has removed in order to take charge of their lives and make it better. 38% in grades 6 to 8 are chronically absent. They're 10 times more likely to experience grade retention, 10 times more likely. The discipline rates, right? You can just look at the first column is our foster youth out of school suspension, and compared to youth and students in overall, you can see that 14% of students in foster care received a school disciplinary action and 12% received an out of school suspension. So that's 3.5 and 4 times the discipline rate as all students. I know that was a lot very fast. We were really trying to speak to address and get the conversation started on some of these issues. Sana, do you want to take over or we want to take a break? Sorry, Ivana. Yeah.
Ivana, what do you think?
How do folks feel? Do we need a break? Do we need a couple minutes to grab a drink and take a break? Thumbs up.
Thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Okay. So we'll see you back here at 1:15 sharp. Thanks. Hi, everybody. We'll wait maybe 30 more seconds and then we'll start diving into Q&A. Thanks for turning on your videos. It's good to see everybody.
So hi, everyone. It is 1:15. Welcome back. Hope you're all able to take a couple minutes to get a sip of water, maybe take a step outside. Not sure because it's really cold. But now we're going to move into a question and answer section. So thank you to everyone who shared their questions in the chat so far. So I'm going to read a couple of those. And if there's more, please feel free to share those out loud. So the first question that I saw was from Drea. And also, I'm sorry if I mispronounce your name, please feel free to correct me.
That's right.
Okay, thank you. Any stats or research on adverse childhood experiences in Indigenous children?
So Kate, I'm happy to defer. I did put a link in the chat to the study that we cited. Unfortunately, in that study, the sample of Pacific Islander and Native American young people was too small for them to put data in that particular report. But that was the one that we looked at, but I still shared the report with everyone.
Dre, any more comment before we move on to your next set of questions that you've added in the chat?
Popped a lot in. I feel like a lot of them ended up getting answered in the interim, so please feel free to skip over it. It seems like we did. But yeah.
Okay, sounds great. I'm just going to read over them anyways, but if, of course, we address them, we can just move on. But you had another one. How can people support children and youth who are struggling, whose parents refuse to engage with professional support resources, IEPs, counseling, etc.?
That is a great question. And that has been a question I feel like I've grappled with for most of my legal career because it can be difficult. There's a stigma in communities of color. You talk about special education, there's certainly a stigma. There's still an ongoing and enduring stigma around mental health. And let's just say, like, that stigma is there for a reason. These are systems that in the past have not been kind to Black and Brown communities. But still, yeah, there are moments when you're working with a young person and you see the pathway to this young person getting what they need, and a parent just, because at times generations in their own family have had negative experiences, are really hesitant. So one, I think it speaks to the fact that we need to be proactive in having conversations in diverse communities about how things like mental health and special education, when deployed appropriately, can help and can be a benefit. On a client level, there have been moments where I've sat down before an IEP meeting and just really gone through, grandma or mom, tell me what are the issues that the young person is having, and coming up with solutions and saying, can we put these solutions in a plan? Not starting with special education, because that's going to evoke a kid being in an isolated classroom in a basement, but starting with the related services and instruction that a kid can have in their classroom, and really just changing the way that I talked about it. And also some of it is just building relationships. Like, at the end of the day, if folks in the communities of color don't trust folk because folk haven't done right by them, that's legitimate. We just spend time talking about how trauma can impact. But if you invest in a community and you become a steady presence in a community and people see you out there advocating for people's kids, they may be willing to listen to you on that issue where maybe they want someone else.
And another question was, I've heard the term CPTSD. Kate mentioned this in her section, but complex PTSD as something manifesting from chronic childhood trauma. Can you expand more on that? What sort of care can be offered during youth? And can it be used to advocate / push for resources?
So yeah, I actually dropped, when I saw that question, I dropped the slide in, which I had taken out just because I think I'm really glad you asked that, because it is so important that we stop using PTSD for kids who have complex PTSD, because it actually just, it doesn't serve them well. So, I mean, obviously what we really, the most important thing for a child is a stable caregiver. And in order to undo some of that complex PTSD or developmental trauma, the stable caregiver who can help them regulate and start to, that stability and that safe environment takes years to undo it, but it does serve it. And sometimes, I mean, that's why we also talk about how important schools are for foster kids, because sometimes the school is the most stable adults and environment if they're moving from home to home. And we really try to get schools to understand that they may be the most familiar setting, and it may also be a place where they have the most contact with friends or even siblings if they've been separated, or adults who've known them for a long time. These things really, really matter. And I just want to touch on the sort of, our construct about children and trauma. For so long, it was like, oh, children are so resilient, and we take that resilient word and we just snap it, right? Because it's like, just because a child is still actually functioning and alive, or you can't see what's happening in them. To me, it just breaks my heart the way systems lean on suffering children even more on their resilience, because a lot of what we see, which is so interesting, even in the past 5 years, the expansion of our knowledge in terms of developmental and complex trauma, and also brain development, is that a lot of trauma shows up right around age 18. Right. And as kids go through different stage of development, they survive. And everyone goes, oh, they seem fine. And then all of these things show up at a different developmental stage, or often when they go to college, or when they sort of become adults by this ridiculous 18-year-old standard. And then and everyone's mad at them. And in fact, what they've been doing, that resilience that we call resilience, is just survival. And then the brain eventually just cannot withstand the years of pressure and the adulthood. So we are so angry at teenagers so much of the time, and we don't see trauma, and we don't see years and years of layered trauma and lack of stable caregiving. We just see a teenager, and we at CFJJ, we're so conscious of judges who are like, I had a tough childhood and I am not doing this and that. That's so many adults say that. And I think that as a community, we really have to start to talk about, think about it differently, because the human instinct to say, I had a this and that and I didn't do that, is so harmful to children who are suffering, or to a young adult who has suffered so much and has survived. And because they've survived, we've decided that they should be over whatever they went through.
Thank you, Kate. Kate, you also touched on this in your section, but is there any more stats you would like to give or information for kids in the LGBTQ IA+ community?
Yeah, so I'm sorry I rushed through those slides. I did refer to the work that we're doing, and I'm gonna put the link to the report that we really, really pushed for, because we've heard from so many LGBTQ foster youth who have said, like, the experience was so traumatic, because many of our foster homes honestly are religious based, and they can be very homophobic and transphobic. And we've been pushing so hard for Massachusetts there are solutions to this. There are homes that can be affirming homes. We should have affirming homes for many different, for children with medical disabilities. Some families just are very, very good and affirming of certain categories. Some people do much better with infants. Some people do much better with teenagers. We have to have affirming homes, because that placement has to be affirming. And that is one of the things that we need to be doing in Massachusetts, and also collecting data. But so, yes, there is some information. We have very limited data in Massachusetts, because the state will not universally collect this information, so we can understand the needs, right? It is important not just to know how many LGBTQ or how many kids identify as queer or non-binary or transgender, but where and who and their race and ethnicity, so that we can make sure that we are supplying true support for a child's entire identity.
So I see two comments in the chat about will these slides be made available after, and I will say that I'm sure they will be. I'm happy to share those with you all after we're done this afternoon. So moving along to the next question from Stacy, what are the conditions that cause Massachusetts to be ranked so poorly? Is it structural factors?
So I assume we mean the 50th rank, the child welfare rankings that I was talking to. So we have known for years that we have a very high rate of placement. These issues, and actually I want to turn it over to Leon because it's not a money issue, which is, so frustrating. This is an attention issue. Child welfare has managed to go under the radar in Massachusetts for a long time. And in some ways, we've done much better with our juvenile justice system reform than we do with our child welfare reform. And we have a very reactive child welfare system. And the concept is really just pull them out. And then that's it, that we have done our job. And that is so problematic to the true life and development of a child.
Yeah, the biggest takeaway is the fact it's easy to think, well, if we just pour more money in, things will get better. Massachusetts is the second wealthiest state in America, and we're 50th in child welfare. Conversely, West Virginia is the second poorest state in America, and they're a top 10 state. It's not just about money or resources, it's about policy and practice, and really it's about choices. Leadership in our child welfare system can do much better than they're doing.
Thank you both. So that is all the questions that I saw in the chat, and just want to open it up to see if there's any other questions that folks have or comments that they would like to share.
Can I just build on the question that Stacy asked? Because I'm thinking about, I know the turnover at DCF is terrible, and they have their policies around licensure are very interesting, and they're constantly hot seat for a child dying in their custody and everything like that. And I find it utterly shocking that we're 50th in terms of child welfare, and no one's been paying attention, especially because they've been in the hot seat so many times that's still flying under the radar. I'm astonished by that. So I just don't know if you all can speak to that more. I know that's not a specific question.
I mean, that's exactly what, and part of what we do really, again, because the outcomes are so extreme, and we're not, I think that child welfare, there's a few issues. Child welfare sort of gets away with lesser scrutiny because it's so complicated. Now, many issues are complicated, but when you take our brains, which operate from fear, right? And the fear of a child being harmed trumps everything, for lack of a better use. I don't want to use that word anymore, but it really takes over, right? How we think about things. Once harm of a child comes into play, how we handle it just becomes secondary, when in fact, I think what we have to do, in Massachusetts, but as a state, but also as a nation, we're starting to do is we can't just think of the first issue. We have to look at the consequences going forward and try to think of this as if we have to remove this child, this is if we have to remove a limb, because it is so serious, the medical situation, we also have to immediately talk about how do we rehabilitate? How do we teach this child to function without this limb? What is the protocol that we then, and that's what's been missing across the country since this concept of quote unquote child welfare 400 years of removing children of color from their parents, from the inception of it, and the lens through which it is seen. And it has been untouched by the concepts, because it's all in the name of helping children. And then, so what we try to do at CFTJ is say, if we all agree we're desperately trying to help children, why are these outcomes so invisible? Why are we not look at this way? And so we know that there's been a lot of progress in terms of talking about trauma. Trauma is now the catchword. Everyone's talking about trauma. But for us, it's sort of, well, how is our conversation about trauma reaching the actual child, right? Or reaching the adults around this child in a way that helps that child? And how do we keep learning? If you are talking about helping children or being in the field that helps child, we should be always learning, always learning. We should all be using our pronouns. We should all be introducing ourselves with our pronouns. We have to, everything we do tells that child that we care about that child's entire identity. And really, you know, the final piece I'll say, and I'll turn it back to Leon and Ivana, is, you know, we also really have to think about the judgment that we hold over these children's family, because it's not just the child, right? It's what we do to the child, but it's also how we view, you know, as I said, this is how we view Black and Brown mothers, Indigenous mothers, and how we view their capacity to parent, and how our systems come together to the pressure of communities and systems that do not allow people to succeed, right? And also, and how do we do all of this in the scope of using the best knowledge and the best supports for families to help children, and not just seeing the child as an individual, that every single child desperately needs to be attached to a caregiver for life in order for that child to thrive. It's not enough to just remove a child from a situation that we deem as harmful.
Yeah, I agree with everything Kate said. And the one thing I would add, when we talk about surveillance, and particularly surveillance of Black and Brown communities, and I admit, I was in this category as well, coming from the juvenile and criminal defense world. We think mass surveillance and cameras, we think policing as a system of surveillance, and they are, but we need to start including child welfare in that conversation when we talk about ways that Black and Brown people are under constant surveillance, because it really is in the same way. And that statistic of Black boys that Kate put in, that's so important, because when we talk about things like stop and frisk and the way that we're under constant surveillance in our communities, child welfare is just as pervasive. So I think some of that is just the narrative and the conversation in really naming that fact that these are systems of surveillance that overwhelmingly target Black and Brown communities. And in the same way that we've had organized pushback on things like mass surveillance and stop and frisk, we need to have that pushback on these, you know, this child welfare level of surveillance as well.
And I think that's a great segue into the next question. It touches on Hannah's point here about how, for those entering the child welfare social work, I'm assuming you're in social work school, what recommendations would you give for us to break these norms in terms of education, advocacy, and challenging hierarchies?
So you know, when I was in social work school, I also worked in the child welfare system and did the work. So I know how hard it is, right? We really do. This is incredibly complicated. You know, I would say that, you know, if you're not putting everything through a policy change of anti-racism, then we're part of the system that is perpetuating it. It is, if you're not actively pushing to make sure that all trainings have an anti-racism lens, we have to dismantle the racism of these systems. We have to really understand the trauma and brain development impact, and make sure that the work that we're doing actually uses that science and the data and the information to not perpetuate you know, what is actually harmful. It doesn't mean that the whole system is harmful. It means that the system is supposed to work to support families. There is a massive amount of federal money that would come to Massachusetts to keep kids safely at home. And we're talking if they can be kept safely at home, to really do that, because that is what even at the federal level, they now recognize is the best policy. But now it takes us the will and the anti-racism focused effort to apply that information and start to shift the way immediately how we interact with families that are struggling. And we're having a very important national conversation about substance use disorders, about mental health, about destigmatizing, about what it really looks like to support someone who's struggling, and a racial reckoning. All of these things have to come into our child welfare system. And I hope that, Ivana and I have talked quite a bit about the curriculum in social work schools and in child welfare classes in social work schools. And do they have an anti-racist curriculum in every single social work school that is pushing new social workers into systems? Because absolutely the turnover in DCF is very high, is incredibly draining, it's incredibly stressful. How do we make sure that we are supporting people who really, really want to help children, also really, really want to help families, and that we think about unconscious bias, and we think about the filters through which they view families, and they view poverty, and they view again, kin and our background checks and all of these things. Is our system actively dismantling the parts of it that are harmful?
And just to add on what Kate has said, so say you enter the semester and you receive your syllabus and you see all the readings that you're required to do. For me, I don't just, to be transparent, I'm in social work school myself. I don't just review the syllabus to look at it like as in, these are the readings I'm supposed to read, really look at them to see if you should be recommending some other options or some more recent options, because I know for me, a lot of the required readings are outdated, or they're from one perspective, or they're not inclusive. So I would just challenge us to push back on some of the required material and curriculum that we receive as students.
No, I agree completely with both Ivana and Kate. And I would just add, and this uplifts the point Kate made, when we talk about training, it's important for everyone working with young people and families to have these trainings, be they anti-racism trainings, be they trainings about the best way to serve LGBTQIA young people, somewhere along the lines in the idea of race or racism, this idea came about that the people who commit harm in the way of racial bias are these outwardly mean, hateful people. And the reality is sometimes you have well-intended but misguided or ill-informed people who perpetuate harm as well. And so when I look at youth justice systems, do prosecutors need to have anti-racism trainings? Yes. Do public defenders? Yes. Do DCF attorneys? Yes. Do CAFL attorneys? Yes. We need to make sure that everyone working with young people has those trainings and are informed of those ways to check their own implicit biases. And we have to be proactive at it. And one of the most important things is naming it. When you talk about implicit bias, a lot of that labeling of young people and knee-jerk reactions and labeling of parents, it happens from a perspective of people not willing to even look inside or check their own implicit biases.
Thanks, Leon. And I see another question in the chat. So have we or a similar organization been reached out to by the city of Boston for their developing the Black Men and Boys Commission? I don't think we have.
We have not, but we would certainly love to hear from them, and we'd be open to the opportunity to work with them.
Sounds like I owe my city councilor a letter then.
Thank you. Are there other questions or comments that folks have?
Do you know of any resources that are available to support parents, especially when they're dealing with the IEPs or disciplinary procedures? I feel like a lot of parents are going to like these expulsion hearings or suspension hearings and feel just so alone and overwhelmed by the situation and feel like the school is against them, not supporting them. And I'm just wondering if you know of anyone that we could refer to or could provide support.
For years, I felt that was intentional. When you walk into those rooms for those hearings and you walk into those rooms, even for IEP meetings, they have that long table and it's all school people. And then there's like the parent and the kid. And just from the moment, the optics of it are intimidating. And I've represented parents and you have to oftentimes just reassure, even given that. And so what I would say is there are a number of organizations, the Ed Law Project, Mass Advocates for Children, Mental Health Legal Advisors Corporation, as well as an organization like CFJJ, where we have those sort of special education one-on-one trainings with some of the slides that we have today, and really with the focus of, just giving parents the tools that they need. So those other organizations I mentioned, they also represent parents. At CFJJ, we don't do direct representation, but we're about giving information because we view it through a lens of community engagement and empowerment, giving parents that information so that they can go forth and be better advocates. So to me, any of those organizations, they have resources online as well. I always encourage parents, because sometimes you get in that room and it's nerve-wracking, go in there with a cheat sheet, go in there, because it's so interesting. Schools get away with a lot. And sometimes a parent just using the language saying, I think this is a manifestation of my child's disability. People in that room will sit back and be like, where did they hear that? You see the whole tone of the meeting change when they see the parents are informed and empowered and are asking for certain things that normally, I'm just going to call it, a lot of school districts will finesse parents if they feel don't know their rights.
And just to build on that, the Federation for Children with Special Needs has a program called the Special Ed Surrogate Parent Program, and they're absolutely wonderful. And they go in for foster youth who need someone who can, and I am one, and I don't know the law the way that Leon does, and I didn't when I started doing it. But just being there and saying focus and asking questions makes exactly what Leon says. Like suddenly they have to have a meeting, right, where they wouldn't have had before. Suddenly just knowing that the child knowing someone's in their rooms, asking the questions and saying, well, is this actually helping, or are you just spending the day in a room by yourself? And that's considered accommodation for you. So you don't have to know it to the extent you don't have to be able to cite the laws. They have to do a lot of the work, and you can just be a caring adult that goes through it, but it makes such a difference. And they do a very good training, that Federation for Children with Special Needs. Their Special Ed Surrogate Parent Program, they do a fantastic training on a lot of this stuff as well.
Thank you.
Could I just say something? This is Betty. Something you said, Kate, that's really struck me. How do we all be caring adults in the lives of children and in the lives of families in our communities? You're naming it about whether we're social workers or whatever our professions are. We all live in communities, and we all live next to people who have families, or if not right next door, they're in our lives some way. And how do we become caring citizens that support children and families in our kind of everyday ethical, moral ways of living with each other? Because all the things you talk about are really critical and important and need our attention. But there are even less visible things that we can do as caring citizens, caring adults in our communities that would support what we are talking about today, being different. I just wanted to thank you, Kate, for saying it, and that invitation for all of us.
Well, I love this question, and it's a question that's in my head all the time. So I wish I had a good answer, because it is, I think it's it's almost like a, there's like a flow to it in your own life as well with, but for me, it was a lot about truly seeing the, not just a child, right? But also whoever their person is. I think that, I am, we're very focused on children. And then, as I said, I think as they get older, we get less and less. There's like this age right around 12, 13, 14, where adults really seem to lose patience with children. Suddenly it's, but we almost have zero patience for their adults, and there is such a lens of judgment, which it's hard. It's hard. I think that our society is really structured as a judging society, and a really angry, you're not doing this, you're not doing that. So, and I don't mean to sound very all sort of, Leon and Ivana know I'm not touchy-feely. I'm trying to be better about the fact that the children need their adults, whoever that is, and those adults need other adults to be kinder about how we view their failings. So it's not a great answer, and I really appreciate the question, but I know that if there's a systemic way, there's the what's inside our own heads, and there's where we in our lives touch or not touch, but are in contact with children and a family. So that's different for everybody. But, part of what is so important for us in doing a training like this is to take as much information that we have and push it as far out into every room, into every human, into every caring adult and person we see, so that we can get this information farther and farther out, so everyone can ask themselves this question: what else can I do? Who else needs to know this? I do believe that what we have in our schools, in terms of, are we going to police our schools more, or are we going to get more people in those schools who are able to help a child regulate, right? Who are going to see a child falling on. Children with trauma are the hardest. We think of them as the ones, if we could, we'll just hug them and it will be okay, because we like to see trauma as something that we can hug. But when trauma comes out and it's irritable and it's angry or it's aggressive or it's shut down, it's harder and harder because we have our own things. But I really think if there's something that we could all do, it would be demanding that our schools, answer that promise of Massachusetts says we have safe and supportive schools. Well, what does that mean? And how are we funding it? And how are we caring for the people in those schools? Is it 0.5 adjustment counselor for 600 students at Brighton High? That's not a safe and supportive school for children who are really struggling. So it's about what we demand for the children, because the school is where they're supposed to go every day. The school is where, and then hopefully that can also flow back into their lives in other ways. It's not a great answer. I don't have a great answer. If I did, I'd make a slide and spend a long time on it, but I really appreciate the thought and the question.
Just to piggyback on something Kate said, again, we are a state of incredible wealth. You drive anywhere around the greater Boston area and you see, every 5 minutes, a new condo pops up. We have money here. But in the same way as money doesn't equate to our child welfare system, you look at our schools and, the American School Counselors Association states that schools should have, at a minimum, one counselor for every 250 students. We're well over that at 303. There are 2 other states in New England who have a lower and better ratio than we do. There is no excuse, given the resources we have in this Commonwealth, to not have that. So again, it doesn't come down to not having money. People say, oh, we don't have money for that. Budgets are moral documents, they're values documents. We have the money. People just simply make the choice not to use it and deploy it to the betterment of young people.
And to the last question that I'm seeing in the chat, do you also advocate on the state level for schools to get the support they need to offer the resources they're legally obligated to provide?
So we do. I mean, as an advocacy organization, we do a lot of advocacy, particularly at the legislative level on school to prison pipeline issues. And I'll let Kate talk about some of our child welfare advocacy, but we have campaigns around a package of bills right now that would bar the suspension of young children, that would restrict suspension of all children, effectively looking at those situations where, which is often the case, a different approach could be taken. And in certain wealthier districts, a different approach is taken, but disproportionately in poor districts, in districts that are predominantly of color, they are not. So we have 2 school discipline related bills that would limit. We have 2 bills addressing the presence of police officers in schools. One would say, if you want to have an SRO program, fine, but they should not be stationed in schools. Your focus should be on more supports and not simply the whole obsession with control. And then a second bill will provide grant funding for districts who say, you know what, we want to move away from a strict reliance on police as the only tool of school safety, and we want to implement other alternatives. It would provide incentivized districts to do that. So that's what we currently have on the school side.
Okay, I just wanted to chime in because I've worked at a school, a level 4 turnaround school in Boston for several years, and I've sat at that table, and I know, like, you're absolutely right. The school does finesse parents, and part of the reason why they finesse parents is because they don't have the resources that they have to provide, and it's not given to them, and so it's just like, so they finesse instead. It's not right, but it's also like the schools don't have what they need, to be doing it all. And I just really advocate, because I'm forever upset because, the level 5 turnaround schools were put directly under state control, and you're talking about all these things that are available and options. And instead of making those things available to all of the state, our governor is making commercials advocating for charter schools. And that is egregious to me. So
yeah, I
would write him a letter based on that commercial.
As you absolutely should, but think about the decisions, that we make. You look at there are certain towns in Massachusetts who disproportionately put so much money, and we're not talking like our larger cities either, towards police officers in schools, while simultaneously, starving out the special education budget and the budget around like school counselors. That's a choice and a decision. Not giving enough out of the pot to our public school systems when their special ed departments are underfunded. That's the decision. So that's why I'm glad you brought up the question. At every level of decision makers, the governors, state reps, state senators, local school board, city council, it is important to always speak truth to power to all of those folks to understand that it's not enough for you to just make a blanket statement. Oh, I care about the futures of our young people. Show it in the decision. Show it in how you vote. Prove it.
Thank you, Leon. So before we wrap up and I turn the mic back to Stacy, we talked about so much today, and there's so much that you probably are all thinking about. I would just ask you all, so before your next call or your next meeting this afternoon, maybe take 5 minutes to write on a piece of paper and really think about 2 realistic action items that you can take in your role to dismantle the school to prison pipeline, the trauma to prison pipeline in Massachusetts. So that is my parting gift homework assignment to you all. I will turn the mic back to Stacy. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ivana. So I feel like this has been completely eye-opening for me, and I feel like for a lot of us. I know we had talked before, but just, some of the things that you've shared today about Massachusetts being the 2nd wealthiest state and the 50th in child welfare, and kind of the reasons behind that. I feel like it's like smoke and mirrors that, everybody isn't talking about this. So I'm glad that we're talking about it today, and I hope you'll come back and we can talk more about these issues and think about how we can support you in your work around this, because it's so critical. And for me, going back to that question around, how are we going to help this kid? Kind of framing everything from that lens as opposed to a punitive lens, I think is a big takeaway. So thank you, Kate. Thank you, Ivana. Thank you, Leon, for the work you're doing. And I don't know how you do it, but you're just, I'm really grateful to you all. And to be continued, we'll keep talking. And thanks to everybody who participated today. I'm putting in the chat a link to our evaluation. So if you could take a couple of minutes and fill that out, just click on the link and fill out the evaluation. And then, like Ivana said, if you could take a couple of minutes and actually just write down something you're going to act on based on what you learned today, that would be really great as well. And I think that's it. We've recorded all of this, so I'll be sending out the recording, and I hope everybody has a good afternoon, and we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much again.
Bye.